We are in John chapter 1. We are still in the prologue for those of you who have not been here with us, although I think most of you have. And last week we had the privilege of hearing some from Josiah. Josiah, thank you. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for sharing some of your story with us. So we're going to continue on in chapter 1, verse 9, and we're going to go down. This will be the biggest chunk we've done so far. Yay, a whole for 4 verses, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We'll do this morning. And I'll read verse 9 to you, and then we'll recap a little bit where we've been, because John's building, he's building as he goes through this prologue. This section here in 9 through 13 is really kind of the trek up the mountain, if you will. When we get to verse 14 next week, it's really the climax of the prologue. It's really kind of what John's building everything to next week. So this is, if you will, the final climb to the climax. This 4 verses right here before verse 14. So that's what we're looking at. This is verse 9 in chapter 1. John says this: "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world." So before we dive into that, let's back up a little bit. 3 weeks ago, last week we heard Josiah's story. 2 weeks before that, we did talk about the light, and we talked about how John brings in Genesis right into his prologue when he starts talking about the light, which goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, where God made the light on the first day. And we said that the reason why he made light on the first day was because all of the rest of life needs light to exist. So back in verse 4 in John's gospel, when he writes, "In him," that is the Word, "was life, and the life was the light of men," he's saying that the life that the Word provides is the source of life for men. In other words, it's the sustaining power. It's the beginning source for life for humanity. And that's what John is pulling in here, is Genesis chapter 1. And then 2 weeks ago, we watched John jump from Genesis to Isaiah. Same concept, the difference between light and darkness, but instead of going all the way back to Genesis, he goes to Isaiah chapter 9, and we went back and we looked at that, and Isaiah chapter 9 verse 2 says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in the land of deep darkness, on them has light shone." And so, in other words, this is a messianic passage, a fulfillment that John will eventually say is the Messiah, is Jesus. And so we're basically watching John just piece together the Old Testament and try to bring us into the present where he is, which is after Jesus has lived, died, resurrected, ascended. And now John's writing this gospel, and he's just walking us through the Old Testament, trying to make these connections for us, all the way back to Genesis, and then in through the Old Testament prophets. He's just connecting these all together. So then we jump into verse 9. And John gives this adjective before the word light in verse 9. He says, "the true light." And it's fascinating because he's been talking about the light, the light, the light, as if it were the only light in the world. But then in verse 9, he says, "the true light," as if there's a false light, as if there's a fake light, as if there's something in the world who's trying to be the light, but it's not. And the reality is that's basically everything that we follow after in life that's not Jesus. Because people look for a source of sustaining power. They look for a source of existence everywhere. They look for it in science. They look for it in a family. They look for it in a husband or a wife. They look for it in a job or success. They look for it in accomplishment. They look for it in money or sex. People look for light, a source, something to sustain them in life. And they look for it everywhere. And John describes the word here as the true light. In other words, the only real source, the only real continual sustaining power. It's the reason why John gives this adjective at the very beginning. He's not the fake one. He's not the one that you'll chase after and never find. He's not the one that you have to continue chasing for the rest of your life and hope you get there someday. A lot of people who look for the light the source of life and a whole bunch of other things. I mean, if we're really honest, it's exhausting. I mean, if you look for light or source of life in your job and then you lose your job and you're like, now what? Or your family, and then you have a spouse that passes away. And it's like, well, now what? When you've put all your eggs in one basket. The fascinating thing is, it doesn't really stray from Genesis too far, because even in the beginning, in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve had this same struggle. Who's the source of knowledge? Is it us? Do we know best? Or is it the God who gave them one rule to follow in the garden? When Satan came into the garden talking to Eve, it was like, did God say that? Do you remember what he said to her? He was like, no, what God's really trying to do is hold you back from being like him. What you really need to do is take hold of this. God doesn't want you to take hold of it, because if you do, you'll be like him, and he doesn't want you to be like him. He's holding back from you. And the one rule that was given in the garden, you shall not eat from the fruit of this tree, of knowledge of good and evil. The one rule that was supposed to be for our good, Satan came in and twisted. No, it's not actually a rule for your good. It's actually a rule holding you back. And we believed it. All of us. They believed it in the garden. But we all buy into it. That this relationship will satisfy you or sustain you. That you can find everything you need if you just had a little bit more money. John says in his gospel, the true light, which gives light to everyone, that was the one that was coming into the world. Not the one that we all chase day to day, week to week. Verse 10 says this. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Now, some of you remember the discussion we had back up in verse 5, when there was this discrepancy in verse 5. Some translations translate verse 5 with the word to know, and some translate it with the word to overcome. I'll read it. Verse 5 says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And I gave you my opinion, which was that overcome was a better way to translate it. But I did say that I understand why people would translate it to know. And I said because immediate context seems to say that. And this is what I was talking about. In verse 10, John says, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. And a lot of people read that, and they go back up to verse 5, and they say, look, it's about knowing Jesus. And it would seem to make sense, other than that in verse 10, remember that word that we talked about in verse 1? That to be verb was, and how we said that it meant eternal, everlasting, presence, no beginning, no end. It continues on and on. That's the same word was in verse 10. So when it says in verse 10, he was in the world, what it's meaning is that Jesus Christ, the creator of everything, has always been a part of everything that we see. It's not talking about the incarnation. It's not talking about him coming and the world not understanding who he is. Verse 10, John is saying, he's always been here. The world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. So here's a different way to possibly understand that. Turn a few pages over to Romans chapter 1, because I think this is what John is saying, and Paul says it a little bit clearer. John's just trying to get through his prologue, so he's just throwing out everything that's in his brain. But Paul goes into a little bit of detail here in Romans chapter 1. Starting in verse 18, here's what John is saying when he says the world did not know him. Paul says this to the Roman church, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. The truth is this, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools in exchange for the glory of an immortal God, for images of resembling mortal man, birds and animals, and the creeping things. So in other words, when John says they didn't know him, the world didn't know him, he's not literally saying they didn't know who God was. They didn't know of his existence. When he says they didn't know him, what he's saying is they didn't honor him for what he truly was. The concept of not knowing a God in this time period was foreign. That's natural to us because there's atheists walking around all over the place. Okay, but in John's time, the concept of not knowing God, that's not even a concept. There's no atheists in this time period. Everybody's worldview involved a God. But when he says they didn't know him, what he means is they didn't honor him. They didn't give him the position he deserved. Didn't respect him the way that he was, being the one whom the world was made through. Creator God. But they didn't honor him that way. So even the context, if you want to go back to verse 5 and say, well, the context says it's clearly to understand. No, not even the context. Because this is not talking about the incarnate Jesus. This is talking about the God who's always existed. Go to verse 11. John chapter 1, verse 11. John says this, he came to his own people, and they did not receive him. So what he's done here in these two verses is he's gone broad. He's always been in the world, meaning he's always been able to be perceived in all of creation, but nobody honored him that way. Then he's going to narrow down to his chosen people. He came to his own people, but they did not receive him. In other words, Israel. Now, I throw out the term Israel not to mean Israel the nation. I throw out the term Israel to mean Israel, the kingdom of the people of God who follow him. He came to those people, and they didn't want him. And then here's the punchline. It's not the climax of what John's trying to get at in the prologue here, but it is the punchline of this section. It's verse 12. John says this, but to all who did receive him, the true light. To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, that's the qualifier, he gave the right to become children of God. A lot of Christians talk about being a child of God. A lot of Christians also use these weird, like, Christianese kind of phrases, like, have you received Jesus? And people out in the world are like, well, Jesus is not even here. How do you receive him? Like, what does that even mean? I don't understand. Well, if you're ever wondering why crazy Christians out there are like, have you received Jesus into your heart yet? It's from passages like this. To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. Okay, they don't come from nowhere, but they're a little bit out there, I guess, if you're not normally spend time in the church. What does it mean to receive him? The ones who become children of God are the ones who receive him. The question is, what does it mean to receive him? And then there's a qualifier. John says, in case you don't understand what it means to actually receive him, it is those who believe in his name. Continuous, ongoing belief is the way that translates. The fascinating thing is that there is a noun for the word believe in the Greek, but in John's gospel, he never uses the noun form. Always the verb form. In other words, John was pretty convinced that belief in the word, belief in Christ, who we're going to get to in down in verse 17. He was pretty convinced that belief was active, that it wasn't just a noun. It's not just something you did one time and that was it. That belief had characteristics of ongoing action. So he used the verb every time when he uses it in his gospel. And the second question that people always ask when you're talking about belief or receiving Jesus is, belief in what? What do you actually have to believe? What do you actually have to buy into? I mean, we've talked about before, could you just believe in this part? Could you just believe in this part? Now, it's kind of a trick question because it's somewhat fleeting. If I had a whiteboard here and I asked you to list out all the different things you should believe about Jesus, and then I asked you to cross off the ones that you could maybe get away with not believing about Jesus and still be saved, everybody would be sitting there going, well, they're all kind of important. But then if I asked you how many of them did you understand when you first believed when you were a kid, you'd say, well, I didn't understand that, and I didn't understand this, and this, and this. So reality is, functionally, you don't need to know everything there is to know about Jesus. It's ridiculous. No, none of us would ever be saved. But where's the threshold? Where's the line? And the thing is, it's kind of fleeting because it's different for everyone. God presents himself to you in a way in which you need to believe for it to be real. For you is different for me is different for you. And then after we do believe, then we go on learning about who Jesus is. And we learn piece by piece. And we continue to believe in those things. But the question is here, belief in what? John's pretty clear. Here's the crazy thing. John says this in verse 12. To all who did receive him, who believed, and then this phrase, in his name, which is weird because, I believe my wife's name is Carissa, but that doesn't really do anything. I can believe your name is what you say your name is, but what? How do you believe in a name? Most of us pray a prayer. Or we say we have a relationship with Jesus. But this says you just have to believe in his name. So what does it even mean to believe in the name of something? Okay, so a little bit of Hebrew culture that is not our culture, so this is weird and different. In Hebrew culture, attached with your name was who you are. It was everything. It was the full package. It's not a portion of who I am, but it's all of me. So when he says you have to believe in his name, it's taking this description that John's given and saying, listen, you either accept it as a whole package or you don't. You can't pick bits and pieces of who the Word is or Jesus is and say, oh, I want to believe he's this and I don't want to believe he's that. No, you got to take the whole package, all of it together. Now, here's the fascinating thing, is that as we've been going, John, and you might have noticed in the very first section, John's been crafting a list of all the things that the Word is. And we've been unpacking them as we go. Eternal, personal, deity, creator of all things created, source and sustainer of life. John's walking you through what you should believe about who Jesus is in order to receive him, in order to become a child of God. He's literally listing it out for you. And so when we get to verse 12, the question is, do you receive the Word who is personal, deity, creator of all things created, eternal? Is that the one that you receive, the source and sustainer of all things, the true light? It's the only way to become a child of God. If you want to become a child of God, you have to receive those truths. In other words, acknowledge that they're true. Do the opposite of what Paul says the world does in the Roman church, which is they acknowledge that God exists, but they don't acknowledge his power or that he is the source of life. You get to choose one way or the other. And what you choose then Jesus then gives you, it says, the right to become children of God. Another fascinating detail here, just in verse 12, one last thing, and then we'll kind of wrap up verse 13 here. John also makes a distinction in his gospel between the Son and everybody else who chooses to receive and believe in the Son. Because everybody he refers to as believers in John's gospel, he refers to them as children of God. But there is only one Son of God in the gospel. See, as careful as John is in his prologue, he's also very careful in the rest of his gospel to only ever describe Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Everybody else who believes and receives the gospel, his story, is described as a children of God. Fascinating that Paul draws this distinction. There's no one quite like him. We'll get to that more in the next couple weeks. Last verse here that we're going to go through. This is a qualification of who is a child of God. Verse 13, or what, I guess, is a child of God. Who is those who receive him? But what does it mean to be a child of God? Verse 13. Those who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. This might seem a little repetitive. Blood, or the will of the flesh, or the will of man, they're all kind of the same. But here's the deal. In the Old Testament, life came through blood flow. In other words, the only things that were really living to the Old Testament community were people or animals who had blood in them. It's why there's Old Testament Levitical laws, like chapter 17, verse 11, where in Leviticus, where Moses writes, "The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for life." So the whole Old Testament sacrificial system is built on blood and the shed blood, the sacrificial blood, because the blood is what signifies life, which makes sense why then we have a Messiah who would shed his blood for us. And John is saying here, it's not about being born of blood. Having life inside of you is not just about having blood running through your veins, which is what these people have believed for a whole lot of years. How are you alive? Well, you're alive simply because there's blood running through your veins. John says, no. You're alive if you receive the source and the sustainer of life and stop looking for it in other places. Sometimes believers, or people who think they believe, they bank their salvation, if you will, on how they grew up. Well, I always grew up as a Christian, so I must be a Christian. I mean, I've just always been in the church. I've just always been around, and no, John says, to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, those are the people he gave the right to become children of God. It doesn't have anything to do with blood. It doesn't have anything to do with heritage. It doesn't have anything to do with being born into a certain community or a certain family. It has everything to do with, did you personally receive the true light, or did you reject him? Nobody can do it for you. Nobody can make the decision for you. Nobody can. To the person who's always grown up in a church, it's kind of a challenge to make your faith your own. To not grow up and just say, well, I've always done this and it's always been there, and so I must be in the community. No, you have to choose for yourself. To the one who didn't grow up in the church, it should be extremely comforting to know that it doesn't matter what my family's done, doesn't matter where my family's been, doesn't matter what the rest of my family believes. I get to choose whether or not to receive these truths, receive the true light, to believe or not. And it doesn't matter whether my blood, the flesh that's gone before me, or the flesh that made me believes the same thing that I believe. It doesn't. Because it only matters whether I receive it, the true light. And it's to those people that God has given the right to become children of God.